While the world remains preoccupied with deafening conflicts in the Middle East, escalating tensions in Europe, and the dramatic rise of China in the East, a quieter but equally consequential shift is unfolding in a place often overlooked: Africa. Beneath the surface, a silent geopolitical transformation is taking place, one that could redefine the balance of global power. And it is this silence that raises a troubling question in the halls of Washington. Is the United States slowly losing its grip on the African continent? At first glance, the answer might seem to be not yet, but a deeper look reveals a more troubling picture. America's influence, once seen as the bedrock of development and cooperation in Africa, is showing signs of erosion, replaced piece by piece by new players, chief among them China and Russia. But this didn't happen overnight. To understand why the eagle seems to be fading in the skies over Africa, we must turn to the past, to a time when the U.S. was seen as a beacon of hope. Through generous aid programs, educational exchange, disease control efforts, and democratic partnerships, the U.S. was once a trusted ally to many African nations. In the early 21st century, initiatives like PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, saved millions of lives, elevating America's image across the continent. The U.S. hosted U.S. Africa summits, trained local militaries, supported democratic institutions, and invested in sustainable development. But as America's attention shifted to wars in the Middle East, military entanglements in Afghanistan, and trade battles in Asia, China moved in with startling speed and determination. Without firing a single shot, without fanfare, China deployed its most potent weapons: infrastructure, soft loans, and a development model free of political conditions. Railways from Djibouti to Ethiopia, upgraded ports in Kenya, mining investments in the Congo, power plants in Zimbabwe. Each road, bridge, and building carried the fingerprint of Beijing. And China didn't stop at bricks and mortar. Cultural and media influence followed. Confucius Institutes sprouted across African universities. Scholarships sent thousands of students to Chinese campuses. Chinese state media, CGTN, broadcast news in English, French, and Swahili. China was not just building structures, it was building futures. Meanwhile, America seemed to have fallen asleep at the wheel. Though aid continued and anti-terrorism efforts persisted, the U.S. presence began to fade in the eyes of many Africans. Washington often arrived with a checklist: political reforms, press freedom, democratic guarantees. Beijing, just contracts and results. And to many young Africans, the generation that will shape the continent's future, the U.S. began to look like a power of speeches, not solutions. A nation of ideals, but not action. Once a symbol of hope, now viewed by some as distant, arrogant, and outdated. And then came Russia, not with dollars, but with arms, mercenaries, and military partnerships. From Libya to Mali, the Central African Republic to Burkina Faso, Moscow deployed a strategy of aligning with local militaries, backing post-coup governments, and establishing a growing sphere of influence. Russia lacks China's financial muscle and America's humanitarian reach, but it brings something else: cold, hard pragmatism and a willingness to do what the West refuses. But while these global giants wrestle for influence, something remarkable is happening from within Africa itself: a great awakening. With over 1.4 billion people, more than 60% under the age of 25, Africa is no longer a passive recipient of aid or pity. It is a continent of choice, a continent of rising agency. Today's African youth are not easily swayed by lofty words. They demand action. They seek respect, not charity. They understand their value, and they know that if America won't come, someone else will. China, Russia, Turkey, India, Brazil. The menu of partnerships is longer than ever. And yet America still holds powerful cards: world-class technology, elite education, and a legacy of human rights that many still admire. But to retain its place, it must change its approach. No more lectures. Africa wants partners, not patrons. No more abstract ideals. Real economic opportunity must be on the table. No more viewing Africa as a battleground in the rivalry with China or Russia. The continent must be seen for what it truly is, a center of its own interests, dreams, and power. Because if not, the eagle may remain asleep in the sky, while other powers plant their flags firmly in African soil. The three-way battle: how the U.S., China, and Russia are competing for influence in Africa. Africa, a continent rich in cultural diversity, abundant resources, and a young, vibrant population, has become a hotbed for geopolitical competition in recent years. Major powers such as the U.S., China, and Russia are not only vying for economic influence, but also striving to increase their political clout on this continent. The U.S., a leading power falling behind? The U.S. has long held substantial influence in Africa through aid programs, investment, and educational initiatives. In the early 21st century, programs like PEPFAR, fighting HIV/AIDS, saved millions of lives in Africa, strengthening the image of the U.S. as a reliable partner. Additionally, the U.S. has maintained military campaigns against terrorism and supported democratic governments across the region. However, in the context of ongoing wars in the Middle East, military involvement in Afghanistan, and internal issues, Washington's focus on Africa has seemingly diminished. While the U.S. continues its aid programs and military support, its image has gradually faded in the eyes of African citizens and governments. They see the U.S. arriving with many conditions: political reforms, press freedom, and the protection of democracy, while China offers practical solutions without political strings attached. Even worse, to many young Africans, those who will determine the future of the continent, the U.S. is seen as talking too much, doing too little. A country once symbolizing hope is now being equated with arrogance, detachment, and outdated approaches. China, a mighty force expanding rapidly. While the U.S. has been falling behind, China has steadily been expanding its influence in Africa with remarkable speed and determination. Beijing does not need to fire a single shot or engage in political propaganda. Instead, it employs a strategy that is subtler but highly effective. China has heavily invested in infrastructure, building railways, ports, and factories across the continent. A prime example of this is China's investment in the Djibouti port, or the construction of the railway connecting Djibouti to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. What stands out here is that China demands no political changes or Western-style reforms from these countries. Instead, China offers low-interest loans, infrastructure projects, and a model of development without conditions. These are the things that many African nations are looking for. Furthermore, China uses Confucius institutes to spread its culture and increase its influence. Scholarships, student exchanges, and news broadcasts from CGTN in languages like English, French, and Swahili help China connect with African intellectuals and citizens. Russia, gaining influence through military power. While China invests in infrastructure and economic development, Russia focuses on military strategies and political intervention. Russia may not have the financial resources like China, nor the aid programs like the U.S., but they possess military power, resilience, and the willingness to take actions that the West avoids. Russia has expanded its influence in many African countries through military cooperation and support for military-backed governments following coups. A prime example is the presence of the Wagner Group, a private military company in Central African Republic and Mali, where Russia supports new governments that have emerged after military coups. While the West may criticize these governments, Russia is willing to work with them without demanding political reforms. Russia offers weapons and military strategies, creating its own sphere of influence without interference from Western powers. The clash of interests and Africa's choice. As these three major powers vie for influence in Africa, the big question remains: who will Africa choose? The answer may not be simple. African nations today are no longer mere recipients of aid. They are strategic partners. They are not just looking for assistance. They want real opportunities to grow and to become leaders in the global economy. Africa's youth, those who will shape the continent's future, are well aware of their ability to choose. They understand that if the U.S. doesn't come, China, Russia, Turkey, India, or Brazil might. Africa is no longer a land of charity, but a global partner with choices. The U.S., China, and Russia all have their unique strengths, but to maintain influence, they must recognize that the strategy in Africa is not just about their interests, but about Africa's interests. The U.S. must return to a strategy of true partnership, not just talking about democracy and human rights, but also creating real economic opportunities. China must continue to maintain sustainable cooperation without imposing conditions. Russia, with its military and interventionist strategies, must continue to assert its presence without making African nations feel exploited. The movement of African nations in the battle for influence and its impact on the future of the continent. When examining the geopolitical competition between the United States, China, and Russia in Africa, one thing is clear. African nations are not passive participants in this game. On the contrary, they are actively engaged, not merely as passive recipients, but as decisive players shaping their own destiny. So, what movements are these nations making in this battle, and how will these movements impact the continent's future? From dependence to agency in politics and diplomacy. In the past, many African nations viewed Western powers, particularly the United States, as key partners in economic development, democratic building, and peacekeeping. However, in recent years, this dependency on the West has gradually diminished. African nations are increasingly realizing that they need to take greater control over defining their future rather than solely relying on external aid. Governments across Africa, particularly in resource-rich regions like West, Central, and East Africa, have begun seeking alternative partners to diversify resources and foster development. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has drawn many African nations in with favorable loans and large infrastructure projects. China is not only constructing ports, railways, and energy infrastructure, but is also ensuring long-term economic relationships while solidifying its political influence. Russia, though not as financially potent as China, employs a different strategy: military support and intervention. In countries such as Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic, Russia has built strong ties with military governments, helping them maintain power. This military intervention, though less costly in terms of financial resources, provides significant political and security leverage, creating long-term strategic relationships. Why are African nations not easily persuaded? These movements indicate a crucial point. African nations are no longer easily swayed by empty promises. They no longer accept Western aid without clear and concrete terms. The youth of Africa, particularly those under the age of 25, who make up over 60% of the population, are more acutely aware of their power in shaping the continent's future. This younger generation is demanding real action rather than lofty rhetoric. They do not want to remain mere aid recipients, but seek to be considered as strategic partners in international relations. They understand that if the U.S. fails to provide sustainable development solutions, other powers like China, Russia, Turkey, India, and even Brazil will step in without hesitation. This has posed a significant challenge to powers like the U.S. While the U.S. continues to maintain close ties with African governments, especially in security and democracy building, there is an increasing sense that their approach has become outdated. Many African countries, particularly newer democratic nations, are seeking partners who can provide tangible development and long-term benefits without the complicated political conditions often demanded by the U.S. or Europe. Africa awakens from dependence to choice. What is fascinating and full of potential in this battle is Africa's awakening. In previous decades, Africa was mainly seen as a target for invasion, colonization, and external-driven development strategies, with no participation from its own people. But now, Africa is no longer a land of aid. It has become a strategic partner with the power to choose its relationships. A prime example of this awakening is the internal political changes occurring within many African countries. Free elections and strong democratic movements have pressured African governments to respond more directly to their citizens' demands. These nations can no longer rely solely on Western aid and must look for internal solutions to address poverty, economic growth, and social development. Furthermore, the diversification of international partners has become an essential strategy for many African countries. It is not just China and Russia. Nations like India, Turkey, and Brazil are also vying to increase their influence in Africa. These countries are not only investing in infrastructure, but are also helping to train local workforces, create opportunities for local businesses, and even collaborate on security issues. This has created a highly competitive environment for African nations. They are now able to choose the partners that best align with their development strategies, rather than being locked into a monolithic relationship with any one nation or power. Impact on the continent's future. The battle for influence between the U.S., China, and Russia is not simply a competition for resources and economic benefits. Africa's future will be shaped by how these nations adjust their strategies. The shifting international relationships, the diversification of partners, and African nations' participation in strategic decision-making will significantly impact the continent's development trajectory. If Africa can maintain its independence in political and diplomatic decisions, it will be able to create sustainable development opportunities for itself, free from external dependence. Building strong infrastructure, developing domestic industries, and fostering a stable investment environment will enable Africa not only to overcome its current challenges, but to emerge as a significant player on the global stage. Conclusion: the battle between the great powers in Africa is not only a contest for influence, but also a sign of a profound geopolitical shift unfolding across the continent. Africa, a continent of over 1.4 billion people, is no longer just a battleground for powerful nations to compete for control, but is emerging as a region asserting its place on the global map. It has long been subjected to exploitation, wars, poverty, and conflict, yet it now stands firm, becoming a strategic partner in global affairs. For decades, Western nations, particularly the United States, have invested significant resources into Africa. Humanitarian aid programs, cooperation in health, education, and development have led to positive changes, but they have also faced challenges and limitations. While the U.S. has played a major role in efforts to address crises, fight diseases like HIV/AIDS through programs like PEPFAR, its influence in Africa has gradually waned. One reason for this is the shift in Washington's strategic focus toward other regions, particularly the Middle East and Asia, where security threats and strategic priorities have drawn more attention. While the U.S. continues to provide support, the rise of China and Russia has brought significant changes. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has been involved in massive infrastructure projects across Africa. Railways, bridges, ports, and vital infrastructure have been built in countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti. But China's influence goes beyond infrastructure. It has also presented a cooperation model that doesn't impose the same political conditions as the West. This flexibility, combined with favorable loans, has made China an attractive partner for African nations. Moreover, China's increasing influence is evident through cultural initiatives, such as the establishment of Confucius Institutes and scholarships for African students to study in China. China has crafted an image of being approachable and understanding, something that the U.S. has struggled to achieve in the eyes of a large portion of the African population. Russia, although not as economically invested as China, has employed a different strategy to expand its influence. Russia has not only relied on investment and economic cooperation, but also used military interventions, weapons deals, and the presence of private military contractors like Wagner. From Libya to Mali, the Central African Republic to Burkina Faso, Russia has formed military ties, providing arms and engaging in conflicts and coups. This is a different approach that has allowed Russia to build trust among African governments, while Western powers tend to focus on counterterrorism or political crisis management without offering deep military involvement. Russia provides support without the heavy political conditions, making it a reliable partner for many African nations seeking autonomy and power. What is crucial here is that African nations are beginning to realize that they are no longer just recipients of aid. They are now partners with the power to choose and decide their own path. In this context, Africa is no longer just waiting for help, but is holding the power to shape its own international relations, development strategies, and foreign policy priorities. This is a major shift that the whole world must take note of. African nations no longer rely solely on the U.S. or the West. They now have the option to choose from a variety of offers, including those from China, Russia, or even other emerging powers like India, Turkey, and Brazil, all of whom are vying for influence on the continent. With over 60% of the population under the age of 25, Africa is entering a new era of growth, where the younger generation not only wants help, but also demands to be treated as equals and partners. This will force global powers to adapt their approaches in working with Africa. What these powers have done in the past, although important, may no longer be sufficient to maintain their influence. The U.S., China, Russia, and others will have to compete for the trust of Africa's youth, a demographic that will define the continent's future. With these profound changes unfolding, it is undeniable that Africa is awakening. African countries are moving forward, not just to receive aid, but to build a foundation for long-term prosperity. Africa will no longer be a recipient of aid, but a decision maker. The countries of this continent will no longer wait for permission from external powers, but will have the right to determine and shape their own future. Africa may not be the fastest growing region in the world, but the transformation in how the world interacts with this continent is occurring at a rapid pace. The great powers may continue to compete in this race, but they will have to change their approach, learning to treat Africa as a true partner rather than a strategic pawn or a potential market. The struggle between the U.S., China, and Russia will not only decide the future of African nations, but will also affect the entire global order in the coming decades. A continent that is rising to become a decision maker on the global stage will bring about changes not only in Africa, but in every other region of the world. Africa, with its youthful population, its aspirations, and its newfound autonomy, will be one of the key factors in shaping how the world operates in the future.